Welcome to The Standard. From Vancouver, I'm Peter Klein. Tonight, a journalist who chronicled events in Iraq before the U.S. invasion in 2003 talks about a recent trip back and how the country has changed. That's a bit later, but first. Back in 2005, Hadani Ditmars published Dancing in the No-Fly Zone, a woman's journey through Iraq. Now, she's recently returned from Iraq for the first time in 7 years, and she joins us in studio. Welcome.
Thank you.
First time you went to Iraq was 97, 98?
97, I was there for the New York Times, yeah.
And why Iraq? I mean, 97 was sort of the no man's land for Iraq. The sanctions were going on a long time. People had kind of forgotten about the country.
Correct. Yeah, the news story of the day was the weapons inspectors, the cat and mouse games going on between Saddam and the weapons inspectors, which at the time I thought would make a great opera libretto, opera buffo perhaps. And that story got tired quite quickly. So actually I had gone there on assignment for the New York Times Magazine, who wanted me to do this sort of day in the life of an Iraqi hospital as a way into the sort of humanitarian tragedy unfolding during sanctions, which were 12 years of draconian sanctions imposed by the UN, which really crippled the middle class, entrenched Saddam's power, and battered the civil society, and empowered some smugglers.
Really,
it backfired in a lot of ways. So I actually went there to do that. There were a few foreign reporters at the time covering the weapons inspector stories, but then things got sort of a little bit more interesting. Zhirinovsky was supposed to come, and so the Times ended up asking me to do some stories for the daily paper. And in the end, the New York Times Magazine editor rejected my story on the day in the life of the hospital because he thought it was too sympathetic towards the Iraqis. At the same time, I was chastised by some poobah in the Ministry of Information for having done something incorrectly in my report in the New York Times Daily, which was actually the first comprehensive look at the humanitarian cost of sanctions. I think it was because my editor in New York had added in a line about the terrible figure of 500,000 children having died of waterborne diseases,
right. Well, that was
according
a big
to
thing.
UNICEF.
Right.
And he had added in, which relies heavily on Iraqi government statistics,
right.
which it does. But if anything, that's an underestimate, because at the time, the whole civil service and civil society was falling apart. So the capacity for recording every death of a child under 5 was quite limited.
Right.
But at the
Although
time,
Saddam did put, depleted uranium was one of those issues that he pushed very hard, saying, 1 million people have died from radiation poisoning. And there was really wasn't any hard science behind that.
Well, also, because of the embargo, there were so many scientific and medical instruments that were barred from entry under the dual use clause, i.e. could have military use, that there was no equipment that could be brought in to measure radioactivity, the equipment that was needed to clearly document what was going on.
Right.
But yeah, so there was kind of a war of information going on, and I was really caught in the middle. And ended up getting expelled by the Ministry of Information, because when I got called in by this grand poobah at the ministry, who I think then went on to work for CNN after the invasion, I was so insulted by him insulting me that he was trying to accuse me of, I think it was propaganda for the Americans. And I said, I couldn't take it anymore. I just said, you used to be the editor of El Saura, which was, talk about propaganda. It was the propaganda piffle sheet for the regime. And after that, I was asked to leave. But what was so interesting for me, and what kind of seduced me about the Iraqi narrative when I was there for 5 weeks in late '97. And I got tired of this sort of information wars. I got tired of the sort of superficial story about the weapons inspectors. What drew me in were the Iraqi people, was the Iraqi culture, was the ruh Iraqiyya, I actually missed the tour of the palaces that was called at 7 in the morning one day because, I don't know, the phone line wasn't working in my room. And so I had this whole Friday to wander around with this young minder who turned out to be a literature student, and I think a nephew of Tariq Aziz, who was a Christian. And we wandered through Karada, we went to the markets, and we talked to women, and we talked about poetry. And I suddenly was like, wow, it just humanized the country for me, because there was this very artificial separation always, between the foreign journalists and And when I go to Iraq, because I have, maybe my Lebanese grandparents, or whatever it is, and I speak a little bit of Arabic, I really can pass often, right? So I had this whole connection that opened up, and I met poets, and I met actors, and I met very interesting women writers, and I felt the pull of what had been the cradle of civilization, but
Right, and
also what had been a very secular and very educated society.
In the book, you really describe sort of the Iraq under Saddam as you just said, a secular society where women have had more rights than in most parts of the Middle East. And the sort of the irony that after 9/11, I mean, there were even songs. You know, I don't know the difference between Iraq and Iran, but I don't really care, right? There was this sort of lumping together
Well,
of
there's
these
not much
two.
difference now.
Well, you know, that's it. Yeah, I mean, but then it really was such a distinction.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, I think it's really sort of a mistake to get caught up in the. I mean, you know, I was labeled by, what are they called, the American Enterprise Institute as a sort of Saddam apologist when I wrote my book, for just reporting on the fact that a lot of people were nostalgic for those days. But that doesn't mean that I was advocating police statism. I was just telling it like it was, because people, you know, as I said, they were not nostalgic for the police state. They were nostalgic for a time when there was, you know, when you could go to the market as a woman and not get kidnapped.
But it must have been odd for you to go back in 2003, because I remember I was there at the same time you were there, and women were in hijabs, you know, certainly in places like Najaf, and that was sort of
changed.
unheard of before, right? I mean,
yeah, it was really strange. I mean, I always use this wonderful story when people ask me about Iraq and what the culture was like. Robert Crouch, the Canadian poet, told me that when I met him in 2005 at the Harbourfront Festival, he said, "Oh, you were in Iraq," he said, because at the time I was promoting Dancing in the No-Fly Zone. He said, "I was there in the 80s, at the height of the Iran-Iraq War." He said, "I was there for the poetry festival, the Babylon Poetry Festival." And he said, "I'll never forget, I went out one night, and the streets were deserted, and I didn't know what was going on, and I thought I'd missed the air raid signal because the Iranians were bombing at the time." And he went back to the hotel and he asked the night deskman, "What's wrong? You know, why are the streets deserted?" And he said, No, don't worry. It's just that everyone's at home watching television because the national poetry competition is on." So, you know, that image of Iraq versus the sort of mad terrorist image, right, post-invasion. I mean, Iraq really was a place, and still to some degree is a place where, you know, poetry is as important as politics, if not more. So I was really seduced by that Iraq, by that cultural reality that I really tried to convey, you know, in my writing, because it really put paid to a lot of these bizarre theories about what Iraq was.
Right.
Now, in a way, it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because there has been this sort of death of culture, but there's been a re-emergence of it. And on my last trip there, I was, you know, the sort of silver lining was that I met with this group of actors from the Baghdad Fine Arts College who were putting on a play about Mudaffar al-Nawab, a famous poet. And they had so much joy and hope and energy, and the theater and the Fine Arts College was like this little enclave of that old secular culture, and men and women mixed together, and there was music and there was expression, and you know, and that's after a period where it was kind of like Iran after the revolution, when at one point, you know, people couldn't dance at their own weddings.
Right. Well, let me stop you there, because what we just described is how you ended an edition of the New Internationalist that you had co-edited about your trip with this sort of positive ending. You'd also done an episode of the New Internationalist about Islam and the status of Islam in the world. So I want to talk about that and a lot more when we come back. More with Hadani Ditmars after the short break.